Shadows of War. Destruction of the Tite fleet. With preliminary judgment into the Badab system and the Segmentum Courts Temporal weighing in the Administratum's favor, an Imperial investigation fleet, including representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus biologists in Vila and the Administratum's lords of the Carthago sector, was sent to Badab to demand the delivery of the Badab Tite and the chapter's gene seed requirements. In circumstances that cannot be fully confirmed or explained, the investigation fleet was fired upon and destroyed in its entirety as it attempted to force its way through the Badab system's so-called Ring of Steel in order to press its demands. No ship survived, and more than 20,000 servants of the Imperium were lost. Soon, claim and counterclaim ensued in the aftermath as to how this tragedy occurred, and Huron, delivering his own dominion's report on the Badab matter to the Segmentum authorities, adamantly insisted that the fleet was fired upon only after refusing to give way to the just authority of the system's master. Within the Carthago sector, outrage at the incident quickly became widespread, and soon such trade links that had remained between the Maelstrom Zone and the Carthago sector were abruptly severed or subject to the harshest scrutiny. The Carthan sector governor, Tanit Koenig, moved to heavily censure the Astral Claws Chapter, along with calls for the arrest and trial of Huron for such treachery against the Imperium. With the weight of suffering and bloodshed elsewhere, the tangle of claim and counterclaim fell on deaf ears. In addition, Huron was the lawful master of a realm permanently on a war footing, a bulwark against the Xenos and Chaos, and, on the most basic level, authorized to defend those domains. Without hard evidence, a charge of willful and premeditated homicide against the Imperium servants would be almost impossible to prove in this case. Over the next 3 standard years, the Carthan Imperial commanders took it upon themselves to send 2 further punitive expeditions into the Maelstrom Zone, but both fleets were lost in unconfirmed circumstances, supposedly never reaching the Badab system. The intervention of the Astral Claws and their allies was suspected. Unable to enforce their will decisively, the increasingly desperate Carthan lords, near bankrupted by this stage, attempted to circumvent Badab itself, taking the far longer and more perilous route in order to access the lost tides directly to make up their shortfall. By 903, the agents of the Carthan Imperial commanders began to spread propaganda in both the Segmentum Astartes and the Senatorium Imperialis to any that would listen. As the local sector administratum continued to press the High Lords of Terra to intervene directly, the Maelstrom warders proceeded to arm themselves for war and conducted sweeps of the Maelstrom Zone in force, while they simultaneously continued to augment their defenses within the Badab sector. Maelstrom Succession 903. To answer the continuing threats to the control of his domain, Huron issued the infamous Articles of Just Succession, which were also signed and ratified by the Masters of the Lamenters and Mantis Warriors chapters. These documents were designed to morally sever the Maelstrom Zone's direct ties to its neighboring sectors. In support of their cause, the documents cited both the Imperial edict that founded the Maelstrom Warders and the ancient rights and ties of the Adeptus Astartes prerogative in their defense, precedents that both weighed heavily in their favor. These articles also called for a full investigation into the Carthago sector, asserting the historic and lawful sovereignty of the Space Marine chapters involved from outside interference by the lower Adepta, and stated again their willingness to defend the Maelstrom Zone from any who would threaten it. As the situation devolved further, the Carthans threatened all-out war, but lacked the means to do so alone. Instead, they petitioned aid to mount an attack from the Departamento Monitorum and the Segmentum Naval Subcommand at Riza, but were flatly refused and informed that the matter was an internal dispute. Met with denials, the Carthago sector itself drafted increasingly large numbers of troops into its planetary defense forces regiments. To further their goal, the Cartan satrap sent several direct and open appeals to several Space Marine chapters with whom they had past dealings with. The satrap had quickly realized that only other Space Marines can truly hope to contest their fellow transhuman Astartes in open battle. The Firehawks chapter was the first to respond to their cause. I wonder why. Badab War. Breaking of the Storm. 904. At the direct request of the Carthago sector's ruling satrap, elements of the Firehawks chapter of the Adeptus Astartes were sent to investigate the disappearance of the Cartan shipping in the areas to the galactic south of the Golgothan Wastes, which border the northern regions of the Maelstrom Zone. In the past, the Firehawks chapter had used the vast orbital dockyards of the Cartan capital world of Sidon Ultra for resupply. The volatile and bellicose nature of the Firehawks chapter was widely known, and it is likely that this also figured in the Cartan satrap reasoning in making her request. This monumental arrogance and folly would soon prove disastrous. Conducting search and destroy operations in the Golgothan Waste, Knight Commander Stibor Lazarek he agreed to dispatch several starships into the northern Maelstrom Zone. One such vessel, the Red Harbinger, entered the Endymion cluster in 904. This ancient region of space was under the stewardship of the Mantis Warriors chapter, one of the Astartes chapters that belonged to the alliance of the Maelstrom Warders. When the Red Harbinger entered the Gallian system, they were intercepted and surrounded by Mantis Warriors' vessels. Ever fierce and proud, they were goaded by the Firehawks' refusal to allow them to board and threats of reprisal and open fire crippling the lone cruiser. With a single act, the full-scale conflict between Space Marine chapters that was to follow was ignited. The Mantis Warriors boarded and captured the Red Harbinger, but the engagement was brutal to the extreme as both sides took heavy casualties. Less than 20 Firehawks were captured alive, and none surrendered, but the struggle brought time for an astropathic message to be dispatched to their chapter, warning of their fate and who they had fought. Upon learning of the fate of the Red Harbinger, Chapter Master Lazarek and his entire Firehawks chapter became incensed and withdrew their forces from the operations already underway. The entire chapter fleet deployed within the utmost haste to the Maelstrom Zone. Soon, matters escalated upon the arrival of the Firehawks, as they were met at Gallian by a task force consisting of both Mantis Warriors and Astral Claw warships. In a tense standoff, the captives were eventually returned, and both sides traded threats. The Firehawks finally withdrew to await the arrival of their full force, and especially their massive mobile star fortress, the Raptorus Rex. The Firehawks chapter fleet rendezvoused in the Sagan system, and aided by their Cartarian allies, soon launched a series of probing attacks and reconnaissance missions towards the Badab sector and the Endymion cluster. But by doing so, escalated tensions to the point that the situation was rapidly proving untenable. Having prepared for war for many standard years, the Tyrant of Badab and his warriors were battle-hardened, and had the advantage of being intimately familiar with the territory of the Maelstrom Zone. The Mantis Warriors proved to be impossible to pin down due to their superlative guerrilla tactics that they employed. Using the Cartans to distract the Astral Claw forces in the Badab sector, the Firehawks struck the agri-world of Ibilis at the edge of the Endymion cluster, attacking civilian targets and burning great swaths of crops, and landed in order to antagonize the Mantis Warriors into fighting them in open battle. Unfortunately, this type of attack had been anticipated and planned for by the secessionists. As the Mantis Warriors pinned the Firehawks in place on Ibilis with their hit-and-run tactics, the secessionist fleet was able to draw their forces away from Sagan. A combined force of the Astral Claws and Lamenter's chapter soon descended upon the Sagan system, and decisively overwhelmed the planetary defense forces and Cartan troops. Badly mauled, the stranded Firehawks and Cartan mortal troops found themselves cut off from supply and behind enemy lines. This forced the Firehawks to withdraw from the Iblis system as they ranked the surface of the planet one final time, and successfully punched through the secessionist blockade that was attempting to pin them in. The Firehawks' Raptorus Rex claimed the life of the secessionist Maelstrom Squadron's only Mars-class battlecruiser, Sacred Tentrak. In the process, when the warship's mighty Nova Cannon proved unable to prevail against the formidable Star Fortress. A lull descended upon the region following these tumultuous events as the secessionists consolidated their gain and the Cartans retreated in disarray. Soon the Firehawks, heavily outnumbered and outgunned, were forced into a long period of retreat to the Maelstrom Zone's fringes, which lasted until the late 904, when the Marines' Errant Chapter answered the call of the Firehawks for reinforcements. This chapter diverted a sizable force of 6 companies and a fleet of support vessels in order to aid their brother Astartes, although their precise motivation for doing so remains obscured. But soon the Starfaring chapter quickly became bogged down protecting Imperial shipping along the Pale Stars region and the outlying Maelstrom Zone's colonies as the secessionists renewed their offensive. The Marines Errant split their forces in an effort to guard the convoys in transit from the increasingly frequent secessionist raids and attacks. Matters soon became more complicated when the Marines Errant were caught between the Firehawks' desire to destroy Huron's forces at any cost and the growing need to protect Imperial shipping and the outlying Carthago sector's colonies from the marauding secessionist forces. This difficulty was further complicated by a conflict of interest due to the ancient ties of loyalty and blood in the Marines Errant that the Marines Errant had forged with the Lamenter's chapter, which they had fought besides as recently as the Corinth Crusade, but now faced as enemies. This led to incidents where the Marines Errant failed to try to do more than drive off the Lamenter's forces during raids, and in which both parties gave quarter to the other, raising the mutual ire of their respective allies. I'm sorry, that's just too funny. Towards the year's end, matters worsened as an even greater number of star systems were drawn into the rapidly escalating war. The Firehawks and their Cartan allies continued to suffer heavy losses in battle. Soon a dozen worlds had fallen in short order to secessionist control, succumbing to direct secessionist assault or by diplomatic submission to prevent the slaughter of civilians. By the end of 904, worse developments for the Cartans and their allies appeared in the form of the notoriously grim and independent Executioners chapter. News had reached the Marines Errant that the Executioners had announced their intention to support the secessionist cause, and payment of an ancient blood oath given by their chapter to the Astral Claws. The Executioners sent their mighty warship Night Hag with a full augmented company of Astartes to aid the secessionists. Desperate Cartan satrap Tanit Koenig was forced to take drastic action as her own tides and supplications to the procurate generals of the Adeptus Terra were long overdue. Nearly bankrupted by their sector's losses in the war, and with their fleet anchorage at Sagantry now in the hands of the secessionists, the Cartan Imperial commanders mounted a final attempt to harvest the resources needed to meet their own Imperial tides from the nearby worlds of Vainiha and Himara, before secessionists could claim these worlds as their own. Unfortunately, the secessionist intelligence network had already ascertained every detail of the supposedly secret convoy and laid a carefully prepared trap, allowing the Cartan convoy to take on the vast amount of wealth awaiting them at Vainia before they were attacked as they were preparing to transit into the warp. The secessionist forces, comprised mainly of elements from both the Astral Claws and Lamenter's chapter fleet, were led by Huron himself. The Cartan convoy was encircled, and then taken one vessel at a time in a series of ferocious ship-to-ship boarding actions. Over the 24 vessels were taken, as secessionist prizes for almost no losses sustained by the attacking forces. Only through the brilliant leadership of Lieutenant Commander Anton Navarez was the Marines' errant capital ship Star Jackal able to escape the Tyrant of Badab's cunning trap, fighting its way clear while sustaining heavy damage. By a twist of fate, the damage sustained in this battle caused the Star Jackal and his brilliant commander to fall behind the Marines' errant pursuit of the Mantis warriors to the world of Bellerophon's fall. It will be there that many of the chapter's commanders and senior officers were to die. The Astral Claws fought the Firehawks back to the edge of the Golgothian waste, focusing all their attentions on eliminating the chapter altogether. The Astral Claws succeeded in inflicting further serious casualties on the chapter, which could no longer be considered an effective fighting force. To make matters worse for the Imperial loyalists, the Marines' errant chapter was drawn toward the industrial moon of Bellerophon's fall by the Mantis warriors. The two chapters engaged in fierce combat, but the Mantis warriors managed to isolate and entrap the Marines' errant 1st and 3rd companies in the Rust Zone, destroying much of their command structure in a series of murderous surgical strikes. The Marines errant were decimated and forced to retreat in disarray. After the deadly battle, it fell to Lieutenant Commander Navarez to mount a rescue mission, in which he succeeded in saving the besieged survivors in a daring counter-raid. In the aftermath of this tragedy, it would also fall to Navarez to take the reins of leadership as the Marines Errant chapter's last surviving senior officer in the war. Anton Navarez would later somehow manage to reform the Marines Errant contingent into an effective fighting force once more, although they returned as a mere shadow of their former strength. Facing bitter recrimination in the light of this tragedy, the alliance between the Firehawks and the Marine Errants all but collapsed. The secessionist forces would continue to make major advances throughout the rest of the year, almost unopposed. The Maelstrom Zone now belonged, almost wholly, to Huron, the Tyrant of Badab. Eye of the High Lords, 905. With different chapters of Space Marines now embroiled in open warfare with the 6th en route along with various naval detachments, local defense armies and the sectarian forces of various adepta now involved in what was rapidly accelerating to become the greatest conflict of its kind since the infamous 4th Quadrant Rebellion, the Imperium's high authorities finally acted. A triumvirate of the Imperial legates were dispatched under the seal of the High Lords of Terra to pronounce judgment over the ongoing strife in the Maelstrom Zone, under orders to leave no stone unturned. Inquisition investigations swiftly uncovered a damning chain of evidence concerning Huron's activities and those of the Astral Claws. Multiple charges were laid against the Tyrant of Badab, ranging from their scarcity of returned gene seed tites to the Legion building to damning evidence of the Astral Claws' direct involvement in attacks on Imperial ships. The Terran legates quickly pronounced that the Badab secession to be a matter of the Imperium's security rather than a civil conflict. They issued an immediate demand for the unconditional ceasefire of all parties and the surrender of the secessionists. Huron immediately rejected their demands. As a result, the Terran legates issued orders for the immediate arrest, pending trial of all chapter masters of the secessionist chapters, and the seizure pending judgment of their homeworld's goods, records, and chattels by whatever force was deemed necessary. The Imperium now officially turned against the Tyrant of Badab and all who stood with him. As for the Cartans, their own role in contributing to and worsening the unfolding events of the succession smacked at best of gross arrogance, but more likely wanton ambition and misrule. Legatian investigations carried out on Segmentum Ultima, capital of the Cartago sector, confirmed these suspicions. They found the Imperial commander and Cartan sector governor, Satrap Tanit Koenig, culpable for provoking the war. and she and the world she commanded were brutally punished. Tani Koenig and her ruling clique were subsequently executed, and the Cartans were made to pay for their transgressions, with the entire 14 billion strong population of Sidon Ultra committed to indentured servitude for 6 generations in payment for their outstanding debt. Full-scale administratum rectifications, audits, and Adeptus Arbitus moral enforcement pogroms soon began moving outwards across the Carthago sector, as the tithe costs and reparations to the Adeptus Astartes were extracted forcibly from the Cartan world, as a process that is still ongoing to the present day. The armed cross-sector conflict and its causes, however, remain unresolved, and the war continued unabated. The Loyalist gather. A major deployment of Space Marine forces was brought into the war at the Inquisitorial Legate Jardins Farron's request to enforce their authority. The Red Scorpions chapter formed the greatest part of the Loyalist Space Marine force, backed by battle companies drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, Fire Angels, and the surviving members of the Firehawks and Marines Errant chapters. These later chapters were ordered to stand down from independent operations and submit to the High Lords of Terra's authority. Though Inquisitor Frayne had theoretical command of the forces prosecuting the Legonites' missions orders on behalf of the High Lords, the overall tactic command of the unified Space Marine forces fell to Lord High Commander Vernat Ortiz of the Red Scorpions as Magister Militum, a first among equals with the commanders of the other Space Marines contingents. Given their inherent dangers in dealing with conflicts between Space Marine chapters and their relative autonomy from direct Imperial control, the Inquisitor Legate Frayne had little choice but to go along with the decision of the gathered Space Marine commanders. Yet he obviously would have preferred as a commander from a more trackable chapter, as the Red Scorpions were famously independent-minded and occasionally factitious chapter in their own right. Lord Commander Ortiz's first command was to deploy his own Red Scorpions along with the bulk of the Battlefleet Solar warships to conduct a series of offensive strike and feints into the secessionist-controlled regions to gouge the resistance. This resulted in the heaviest naval engagement of the war to date, at the decisive Battle of Silent Reach in early 906, when cruiser squadrons of the Maelstrom and Lamenter's fleets clashed with the Segmentum Solar and the Red Scorpion's warships in the barren void between the Gallian and Grief star systems. This engagement proved inconclusive, with both sides suffering damage, but few losses of any major warships by both sides. The only serious loss sustained was by the Maelstrom's fleet's flagship, the Overlord-class battlecruiser Gauntlet of Wrath. The Secessionist fleet broke off from the engagement into the warp soon afterwards, leaving the Loyalists to claim a tentative victory. A dozen such engagements occurred in a short space of time during this period. The Loyalists quickly succeeded in checking and containing the Secessionist advance in the early part of 906, especially with the addition of the remaining Marines Errant and Firehawks forces after they were cleared of heretical or seditious intent. In pursuing this strategy across a broad front, hoping to reveal a weakness in the Secessionist defenses, the Loyalists soon discovered, quite remarkably, that no such weaknesses were apparent. Thus the Loyalists were forced to change their strategy. Firebomb of Sanskrita, 905. Burn them all. The God Emperor will know his own. Stibor Lazarek, Grand Master of the Firehawks, during the firebombing of Sanskrita. Before they submitted to the legate's will, the Firehawks had one last act of bloody vengeance to carry out, which has since been entered into the imperial history of the war as the infamous firebombing of Sanskritan. In what is widely regarded as strategically wasteful and vainglorious assault, the bitter Lazarek used his surviving chapter fleet, led by the Raptorus Rex, to conduct a retaliatory orbital assault on the frontline planet of Sanskristan, a sovereign world on the edge of the Endymion cluster. Over a period of several solar days and nights, the Firehawk's Chapter fleet systematically laid waste to the planet's few cities, slaughtering their inhabitants before they finally withdrew from the system, leaving the planet aflame, wiping out more than 90% of its population. Vinaya raids. Lord Commander Ortiz' next valuable target of opportunity presented itself in the form of the Vinaya system. Vinaya was an important world and served as the gatehouse along one of the secondary warp routes around the rim of the Maelstrom. Furthermore, its defenses and garrison were weaker than the heavily reinforced Sagan system. There were further intelligence reports indicating that the secessionist occupied world was awash in civil unrest, which might be stirred up in an open revolt by a loyalist attack. While the Firehawks and the newly arrived Raptors Chapter conducted patrol and escort operations, the Red Scorpions, Marines Errant, and Nova Marines conducted a three-pronged raid on the Vinaya system, with the target of damaging its production capacity and orbital transships platforms. This would effectively weaken the secessionists' grip on the system. Confronting the reformed and reorganized Badab sector human auxilia of the Tyrant's Legion in open warfare for the first time, the loyalist Space Marines had greatly underestimated them, and as a result, their strike groups were largely prevented from achieving many of their goals in the first raid. Only 4 orbital platforms were taken out of action, and though they managed to damage Vinaya's manufacturing complexes, production was not significantly affected. Data intercepted from the Vinaya Command Vox network, however, revealed the price of the Tyrant's Legion resistance, with the Loyalists inflicting a greater than 178 to 1 kill ratio. In 906, the Red Scorpion forces conducted the last of Vinaya's raids, which proved particularly bloody for the Tyrant's Legion. The Red Scorpions invaded the Kalian industrial hive city, with the specific goal of inflicting mass casualties on the human defenders and picking off their Astral Claws masters when they were found within their ranks. Despite the attacks, the secessionists maintained control of Vinaya, and shortly afterwards, further ill news came to the Loyalists, informing them that several military convoys from the rear supply lines from the Carthago sector had been attacked and scattered by an unknown warship that later proved to be the Night Hag of the Executioner's Chapter. They also received more disturbing news in regards to the fate of the fortress world of Sangrada, deep within the Maelstrom Zone. Refusing to bend their knee to the Tyrant of Badab, this fiercely independent world had held out against the secessionist fleet, but Cerngrad, that's the correct way I guess, Cerngrad had partly succumbed due to treachery from within, and Huron's forces now controlled the northern citadels, remaining too deep within enemy territory to mount an effective relief operation. The prospect of the ancient fortress world falling to secessionist control proved to be a grim prospect for the Loyalists for a future siege. Betrayal at Grief, 906. After the Vinaya campaign, there was a brief lull in the constant fighting, an impasse that was unexpectedly broken by the secessionists with a remarkable proposal. Personally sending his emissary to the Loyalists, Huron offered a temporary ceasefire and honorable parley with the Magister Militum in order to avoid further bloodshed between the two parties. Despite the Inquisitor Legate's strong objection, Lord High Commander Ortiz agreed to the meeting, trusting Huron's word as a fellow Chapter Master to maintain the truce. Ortiz had also equally promised to show his intention to remain iron in his resolve to carry out the judgment of the High Lords. The parley was arranged to take place on an abandoned way station in the orbit around the gas giant Shedim, in the outer reaches of the uninhabitable Grief system. Reconstructed from the damaged and recovered records, what occurred next remains a point of contention and stubborn enigma to the present day. The void station was located on an asteroid mass, abandoned some centuries before due to solar flare activity. Each party consisted of their own respective leaders and their chosen honor guard, which was deposited on the asteroid by Thunderhawk. Upon the opening of negotiations, it was readily apparent that it quickly devolved into an acronymous and volatile atmosphere. Huron, who was in an imperious mood, commenced by ranting against the Maelstrom Warder's supposed contravention of Imperial law. He also went into ranting diatribe against his enemies and their perceived enormities and insults. Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors was also present with Huron's party, whom swiftly accused the Firehawks chapter of perpetrating wanton crimes of genocide. For his part, Lord High Commander Vernat Ortiz stood firm, reiterating the legatine right of authority and the unassailable right of summons. Soon, an adjournment was called for, as the talks became heated, and both parties withdrew to separate compartments on the voice station to confer with their fellows. Matters of record remain regarding the following incident becomes muddled and contradictory. Loyal's communication to their strike cruisers was suddenly cut off as 3 unknown vessels attacked from concealed position deep within the thick atmosphere of the gas giant Shedium. These attackers assaulted the asteroid base before either Loyalist or Secessionist vessels could respond, ranking the way station with a devastating salvo of weapon fire, before boarding with an invading party comprised of heretics, mutants, and other renegades. In the ensuing melee, the Loyalist delegation, including Lord Commander Ortiz, was killed, and several members of Huron's party, including Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, were also slain. During the 3-way space battle around the way station, the Red Scorpion's chief librarian, Severin Lot, valiantly launched a counterattack and recovered his fallen Chapter Master's remains. The Red Scorpions clashing with both the Raiders and Huron's Astral Claws before both sides broke free from the disintegrating asteroid base to avoid certain death. Severin Lot had saved the honor of his chapter, against all odds, and in doing so wrote an enduring legend for himself despite the bitter blow the Red Scorpions had suffered. During the reluctant chaos, the Tyrant of Badab had somehow made his escape early on, and what hand he had in the deaths of Lord Commander Ortiz or even Chapter Master Sartak cannot be confirmed. In the aftermath, this incident, which became to be referred as the Betrayal at Grief, many within Loyalist ranks blamed Huron's perfidy for the attack, claiming it as rank treachery, while the secessionists laid the blame at the fleet of the Inquisition as a plot to assassinate the Tyrant of Badab by covert means. Inquisitor Legate Jardais Frarin, concluded that the incident may have been due to the possible intervention of third parties of malefic design who wished to benefit from the continuation of the war as the whole region descended into bloodshed and anarchy. Frain also did not rule out the possibility that the plot was carried out by Huron himself in order to assassinate his erstwhile ally, Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors. Ortiz's death merely served to seal the assassination in a shroud of doubt for friend and foe alike. Evidence from that tie had been uncovering of growing disquiet among the Mantis Warriors and their support for the secessionist cause. Committed as they were to protecting their fellow Maelstrom Warders from outside aggressions and defending their sacred independence and rights of the Adeptus Astartes, they still saw the direct judgment of the High Lords of Terra as something not to be disregarded. Rumors concerning the rule of the Astral Claws within their own domains had begun to circulate and had been the cause of disquiet for some time. Sartak's death more than likely served to ensure the Mantis Warriors' resolve, particularly if it could be laid at the feet of an enemy chapter. So much the better if that enemy would blame the Mantis Warriors for the death of their own. Now the possibility of rapprochement between the two opposing sides had been effectively destroyed. The war soon escalated even further, with no quarter given by the Red Scorpions or Astral Claws. Soon, secrets would be uncovered that would lend to the cause of the secessionists an even darker hue.